Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Blumstein. He's a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a professor at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. He is a behavioral ecologist broadly interested in the evolution of behavior and the application of behavioral and evolutionary principles to policy, health, and defense. And today we're going to focus mostly on predator-prey research, anti-predator behavior, and related topics. So, Dr. Blumstein, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
So, tell us first, what is predator-prey research about? I mean, what are the kinds of questions you explore there, and what aspects of animal behavior are we talking about here exactly?
So I just came back from a conference on predator-prey behavior that was called a Gordon Research Conference, where people come from all sorts of different disciplines who have one focus, and that's sort of understanding the causes and consequences of anti-predator behavior and predation, really, in ecological communities. So really, this conference went down sort of, bacteria having predator-prey dynamics all the way up to blue whale behavior and everything in between. So it encompasses a huge scope of life around us. Pretty much everything at some point in its life has some predation risk, has some risk of being killed. And we can go down and we can look at proximate mechanisms, trying to understand this. We can use these as models for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a lot of biomedical research does. We can go understand, how, as Larry Dill says, ain't nature grand, how exciting it is that we see all of these adaptations in the wild, and then we can go up and look at the ecological consequences. So, the idea that prey not only kill things to limit populations or potentially regulate populations, but there can be fear effects. The risk of predation, the perceived risk of predation, shapes where individuals go. And you know that yourself. You're probably less likely to go to a dangerous neighborhood than a safe neighborhood. And when you're in that dangerous neighborhood, it changes your behavior, et cetera. So, the insights from understanding anti-predator behavior are broad and really exciting.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what kinds of anti-predator behavior are out there?
A variety of things. And it really sort of depends on the level you want to sort of look at it. So in an immediate sense, fight or flight, right? If something scares you, do you move away? Now, and sort of elicit something to make you safer. For things that don't move, that could be closing up. So if you're a giant clam, one of my favorite species on Earth, they close when they get threatened and they retract their mantle. And you can see bites out of the mantle. And every once in a while, when we're studying clams for a month, a clam disappears and it's been preyed upon. So, there can be predation even for things, certainly for things that don't move. It could include a suite of, so those are sort of behavioral responses. It could include a suite of morphological responses, whereby animals have spines or other defensive compounds. It could include crypsis. Some animals, camouflage themselves. This is an anti-predator behavior sensu lato, in the sense that, it's an anti-predator trait. It's an adaptation. There are aspects of sort of developmental priming, if you will, that if you grow up in a risky neighborhood and you're an animal, or maybe even a human, that's going to sort of set your life down a particular trajectory, and there are ways of thinking about that. Because if it's risky now, it's likely to be risky later. If it's risky later, then you don't really want to live a long life. You want to sort of live fast because you might die young. So there are a suite of temporal, spatial, internal, external things we see that are in response to predators.
Mm-hmm. Do animals respond specifically to the levels of predation in their environment and regulate their behavior accordingly?
Wise animals do, but we assume that if animals have the ability to, and that's a big assumption, the ability, there may be constraints, the ability to sort of track predation risk in some way, that individuals will do better. And that's because than those who don't track predation risk or don't estimate the true risk of predation. And that's because, as a behavioral ecologist, we like to sort of think about predation risk as, in an economic framework. That if you invest a lot of energy into making yourself safe, you're not investing that energy into something else. So I wrote a book called The Nature of Fear, Survival Lessons from the Wild, and one of the insights is that you can't assure perfect safety. I mean, you can, but you're going to starve to death. So if we view the world as here's a safe place, a perfectly safe place like a burrow or your home, and here's a risky place or a potentially risky place, a place you've got to go out to work or to feed or whatever. These are two patches. So you can eliminate all risk by staying at home, but you're eventually going to starve to death. So animals have to take risks. They have to trade off risk versus reward. And those that do that best leave the most descendants. They have the highest reproductive biological fitness. And in that sense, we see that some animals can track risk quite nicely and allocate more energy, time, etc., to defending themselves against things that are relatively more risky. But these can be miswired. There can be ways that animals aren't able to detect threats because it's an arms race. Predators are trying to feed, prey are trying to survive. This has been called by Richard Dawkins the life dinner principle. And the life dinner principle sort of illustrates the dynamic nature of this game, and that anytime a prey gets a better adaptation or a better response that allows it to survive a bit better, that may cause the predator to starve or not make it. And over evolutionary time, we expect the predator to get faster, get better, the prey to get better, the predator to get faster, better, etc. And you sort of see this, paleontologically, if you sort of look at the evolution of fast cursorial predators like cheetah, and you look at their ungulate prey. And what we have in North America now is we have no North American cheetah, but we have pronghorn antelope, which can sprint, at incredible speeds. And that was driven, that arms race was driven by living with North American cheetah.
Mm-hmm. Does these animal responses to levels of predation in their environment manifest themselves in terms of gene regulation, for example?
I would say we know a little less about that. So there are links between detecting predators, threats, and a suite of potential genetic change, including differences in genes that are expressed at a time and epigenetic changes. Epigenetic changes are changes to the genome that come through experience. And I'm sort of looking at aging these days in yellow-bellied marmots. I run a long-term study of marmots in Colorado. It's the third longest study where we follow the fate of individually marked mammals in the world. It's been going on since 1962. I'm not that old. I inherited it from a friend and colleague, Ken Armitage, who started it in 1962, and I took over in 2001. But we've developed what could be called an epigenetic clock, a molecular clock of some sort, where we can say, here's your chronological age, and here's how here's your age, and here's how this is associated with a suite of changes to your genome, epigenetic changes to your genome. And you can sort of look at animals that are older than expected, less than expected, and what we're trying to do now is look at the consequences of this. So we have this great clock, but now we need to put it to work and try to understand, our predators driving accelerated aging, if you will, or what are those stressors driving accelerated aging, and that's sort of the work we're doing in the future.
Mm-hmm. Is anti-predator behavior in any way related to the evolution of certain aspects of the sociality of a given species, like a prey species, for example?
Well, some of the ways to be safe. So if you're a prey, you want to, prevent being detected by a predator. Mm-hmm. You want to detect a predator if it's there. You want to, and there's a suite of adaptations for that. So you might be camouflaged, you might avoid certain risky areas, then you might have anti-predator vigilance to help detect it. This vigilance can be in any modality. You can be listening, you can be smelling, you can be feeling for vibrations, you could be looking. Then, given its detection, you need to make decisions about escape. And that what you do, whether you escape or freeze and become cryptic, may depend on a suite of things. So if you're a young ungulate, a young deer, crypsis and immobility typically go together. So if you detect something, you're kind of freeze, and then you're cryptic. If you're an older ungulate, you might run. Same species. And there are, in some cases, benefits from living with others. So social grouping is living in a group, living with other conspecifics is a recognized anti-predator trait. Now, it may increase the probability that you're detected by a predator because there's more of you there. So if you're wandering around looking for food, you might miss a single individual, but you might see a school of them or a herd of them. So how that trades off in real time, how that varies over time, who joins the group, what are the roles of individuals of the group are areas of active research interest, including some of my interest. I study marmots, which more or less live in an address, so the groups are more stable, but many species group and group up and then form aggregations while they're foraging, and then break down and are less aggregated. And these sorts of temporary foraging aggregations probably track predation risk more than stable group sizes.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you specifically about alarm calling, because that's one type of behavior that certain animals resort to. So how and when do animals alarm call?
So if you walk your dog, or you go for a hike in some park or something, and someone walks a dog by you, and there's birds or squirrels around, you may start hearing some vocalizations. You may hear those animals say things. Those are alarm calls. These are calls that are elicited by predators. Alarm calls can have several functions and several targets. They could be directed to the predator. So for predators that require stealth, once you've been detected, game's up. They could be directed to conspecifics. They could create pandemonium. So sometimes if someone alarm calls, everyone takes off and flies away, and it's difficult to follow an individual. They could be directed to conspecifics to warn key individuals, your kids, for example. Oh, there's a predator in the area, look out. And these are not mutually exclusive. They can do all of these. So it's sort of difficult to sort of tease apart who the target of these are, and we see evidence of all of these in a variety of species. Alarm calls can be quite specific, and for a while, people, myself included, have tried to understand the evolution of human language by thinking about the specificity of these alarm calls. So language has many attributes, and one of those is the ability to label external objects or events. This is a phone, so I would say phone. This is a pen. These are different words, and these are different things describing different things in the external environment. And you can sort of think about this and say, well, if there are eagles and there are coyotes or wolves, some animals might say eagle, some animals might say coyote or wolf, or they might classify things into this is a terrestrial predator, that's an aerial predator. So a lot of work has looked at this, and there are a variety of species that have those abilities, but certainly not all species have those abilities. And what turns out that there's a lot of different ways to survive. You don't have to have language-like communication in order to have a really effective alarm calling system. You just have to maybe modify your calls according to risk, and receivers, your intended audience, if they're conspecifics, have to respond to that. So we see a variety of things that different species do to communicate risk and respond to risk.
Mm-hmm. But these alarm calls, and I think that's something you were pointing to, they can be specific. I mean, perhaps one alarm call for each specific kind of predator, or more generic, right?
Exactly. So, vervet monkeys are a pretty good case study in East Africa, where they were studied for years. They have a specific call that's associated with an eagle.
Mm-hmm.
They have a specific call associated with a snake. They have a specific call associated with a leopard. And what's interesting is when you play these calls back, when you record them and broadcast them, individuals respond in the appropriate way. If it's a snake, they all get up with their toes and point and look around on the ground, because that's where snakes are likely to be. If it's a leopard, they climb up trees and go to the peripheral branches, because the leopard isn't going to be able to go to the peripheral branches. If it's an eagle call, they climb up trees and go to the center of the tree, because an eagle is going to have a hard time, flying into the tree. That's word-like communication. Those are externally referential utterances or vocalizations. So there is an example of a remarkable degree of specificity that has been studied by first seeing what elicits the calls, and there's pretty much a one-to-one matching, and then seeing how those calls, divorced from the actual predator, elicit responses, and there's a one-to-one matching. Not all species do that. Chickens do. Chickens are pretty smart.
And when is it that animals resort to escape strategies?
Well, I would say at some point, if a predator is coming towards you, eventually you're going to move off and leave. And this is true if you're in a city park where you're probably not going to step on the pigeon unless maybe you're feeding it. But if you walk towards things, eventually they're going to move off. This has spawned a huge literature of studies where people have looked at the flight initiation distance of a wide variety of species. I've got a Fulbright fellow right now who's pulling together all of the studies of bird flight initiation distances. We're debating whether it's going to be 130,000 flushes or 180,000 flushes, but we'll see soon. But there's a lot of people have flushed a lot of different species of birds, and we're debating whether it's going to be 1,000 species or 3,000 species of birds. Remember, there are about 10,000 species of birds. So people have gone around the world and are increasingly going around the world and sort of flushing birds. So this is a standardized way to look at escape response across a variety of different species. A bunch have been done on fishes, a bunch have been done on lizards, a bunch have been done on mammals. Birds are the biggest data set. There's something about people that they like to scare birds. I don't quite get it. But anyway, I've scared a lot myself. But we learn a lot from this. We can ask all sorts of interesting evolutionary questions about the ecological and evolutionary drivers of this. We can ask questions about relative flightiness and adaptability or plasticity. So a lot of urbanization research, a lot of interest in understanding which species can co-occur with humans and why and how. And I'll say that I sort of became very interested in this because when you put a hiking trail in, you start losing species. Why is that? What do we need to do to not lose species? Can we predict what species are going to be most vulnerable? So I started studying flight initiation distance in birds in a broad comparative way to get insights into that. And we have lots of insights into this now. We know, for example, that urban birds around the world are more tolerant of people than rural birds. We don't know why. Could be three things. Could be that they learn it in some way, they habituate or have other forms of associative learning where they learn that people are probably benign threats in urban areas. It could be because individuals differ, which we know, and some individuals can tolerate humans, and those are the ones that settle in cities, and some individuals can't, and those are the ones that are in the suburbs. And it could be adaptation. It could be genetic change over time. It could be that animals are in the city, some die, and those that are survivors have some genetic predisposition towards being more tolerant of humans. And understanding those mechanisms is really interesting because in a changing world, in a dynamic Anthropocene, we need to understand the limits of plasticity and the mechanisms that lead to plasticity. And some of these learning-based, habituation-based mechanisms of tolerance for species that have that might allow them to exist more broadly than species that don't.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, talking about the sort of relationship between predator and prey, it's the case that evolutionarily speaking, there's always an arms race between them, right?
So I think that it's always good to sort of think about traits, individually acting on an actor. Maybe that's a species, maybe that's an individual, maybe that's a population. But that many of these actors are not, divorced from an orchestra, or a cast, and there's other players in that cast. So game theory, which is what arms races are sort of, modeling, says, well, it's not just what you're doing; it's what others are doing, and your fitness not just depends on what you're doing, but what others are doing. So game theory is a way to begin looking at those dynamics. And often, these are two-player dynamics, but the world is much more complex than that. And, almost all species have more than one predator. Those may vary over time. And some people have begun to sort of look at more complex three-species dynamics. So, desert rodents, owls, and then snakes, right? And then that gets more complex. But there's also jackals or coyotes in this system. So putting all of these in gets increasingly complex. And I'll say that ecology is probably the hardest subject out there to study. Years ago, I was at a kid's birthday party. A UCLA professor, it was a UCLA kids party. Our son went to daycare at UCLA. I was talking to a physicist, and I said, we have a lot of envy towards what you guys do. We have physics envy. I go, you guys are answering questions with such precision, 30 decimal points to the right of zero. And we can, if I explain 30% of the variance, I'm happy. And he's like, yeah, but you're the hard science. You're the ones who, life is super diverse. Ecology is super complex. I don't even know how you start to study ecology. So, there's a lot going on out there. And as we begin putting predation risk into sort of a network perspective, that there's links between many species, it gets increasingly complex. And that's cool. That's life. And our challenge is to sort of understand that.
Mm-hmm. So earlier I've asked you about how anti-predator behavior might influence the sociality of a prey species. What about being a predator? Does that also influence the sociality of a predator species? I mean, how the individuals there establish relationships among themselves, how their society is structured, and so on.
Right, so that becomes a foraging question, right? And you think about the energy in ecosystems, we think about pyramids, right? So there's a lot of grass on Earth, and there's few, orca and few lions. And that's because it takes a lot of energy that gets concentrated up a food web to sort of lead to predators. And the higher up, the more links you have from, grass to ungulates to some mesopredator to some, top predator. You sort of have fewer of them and less biomass of them because it takes a lot of biomass to produce a few predators. So from that alone, your first hypothesis would be, well, maybe, predators aren't going to be that social. And a lot aren't. But if you're social, you have the potential of being able to hunt together and take down bigger prey than you could take down alone. And you sort of see stuff like that when you look at cooperative hunting predators, whether those are orca or whether those are lions. And what's really interesting is that whether this is true cooperation or is an illusion is really interesting and is a thing of active debate, because you can have what looks like very complex coordinated hunting behavior that comes about by very, very simple rules. Go towards closest prey. So if there are multiple predators around, they'll all go towards closest prey. Once you're at that prey, if a conspecific is there, get as far away as you can from it, the other conspecific, and that can lead to circling. Then a third one comes in, and you have three individuals circling the prey, and it looks all coordinated. Is it coordinated? Is it complex? That's a real simple rule. So when people are looking at cooperative hunting these days, the questions really are, what's going on? Do animals modify their behavior in response to others other than simply, acting like an electron or something? Or is there more going on? And that's hard to demonstrate. Clearly it happens in some. Predators that eat non-divisible prey could cooperate, like meerkats, right? So meerkats are predators. They eat insects mostly and lizards. They're not really dividing and sharing their prey much, and they can live in groups. But a lot of times, a lot of species are more solitary in many situations. So it really depends on the prey, and it becomes a foraging game, and what's the best way to get energy.
Mm-hmm. So for the second part of this interview, I would like to get more into questions regarding conservation. But to introduce the topic, have we humans been shaping in any way anti-predator responses in other species? And if so, what are the consequences?
Well, yeah, I was talking about flight initiation distance, how close you can get to something before it swims away or hops away or flies away or walks away. slithers away. And the answer is what we've seen is we've had a profound impact in urban areas, that most animals in urban areas, compared to rural areas, allow you to get much closer to them. Again, has that changed the behavior? Well, if individuals that tolerate humans are there, you've changed this, but individuals that don't tolerate humans are outside, might not have changed the behavior. We see a pattern, but change either requires experiential learning of some sort, habituation, or it requires selection. I suspect there's evidence of both, but we certainly see patterns where animals around people behave differently than animals not around people in terms of their anti-predator behavior. Now, this raises a number of interesting questions because there can be really important consequences to this. So when we were talking about communication a little while ago, and the specificity of communicating about predators, you would expect that animals should be able to communicate about risk differentially for predators that create different risks. At least classify high risk and low risk, or by hunting strategy if the escape strategy should be different. Yeah. So one question that people have wondered is, and sort of an assumption that people make, is that by habituating animals to humans in, say, cities or parks or whatever, hiking trails, this makes animals more vulnerable to real predators. Now that's really interesting from several perspectives, and it seems to be true in at least one species of monkey in southern Africa. And it might be true in other species as well. And if that's true, that means our presence basically lets down the guard towards all sorts of anti-predator behavior. There's a generalized relaxation if you get accustomed to people. And that isn't a good thing because predation is, often has a big effect on population dynamics. But that assumes that prey are classifying predators as they would classify humans, that they're putting them in the same category. And that's an interesting perceptual question. So we've done a number of studies with dik-diks, which are small African ungulates, and birds and other things, and deer. And the question is, can you discriminate the sound? Many prey species discriminate the sound of predators from non-predators. The predator vocalizations they respond to, and they raise their risk or they escape upon hearing them. So we said, can you discriminate a predator and a non-predator when you're around people? And the hypothesis that general habituation to people is transferred to general relaxation of other predators would predict that no, if you're mellow about people, you're not really going to distinguish predator from non-predator when you're around people. The alternative prediction is when you're far from people, you expect there to be a difference. In the studies I've been involved with, we found the exact opposite every time. And we explain this because when you're far from people, the animals are not accustomed to us, and they're like looking at us. And we have sort of, you can call it an experimental artifact, or you can call it just they're really alert and they're responding to anything. And they're not discriminating between predator and prey vocalizations, meaning they're not, meaning they're just generally wired when we are near an animal far away from where people typically are. And around people, we found that discrimination. So I think that raises a super interesting question about ecotourism. We're probably not making most species dumb, generally, but we could in some cases, and we need to know that. But more importantly, going to remote areas where animals don't see people typically is probably worse for the animals than going to areas where a lot of people already are.
So when it comes to the conservation of wildlife, having this knowledge about anti-predator behavior and responses, what can we do with it to help conserving different prey species? Are there, for example, specific interventions that we can do or not?
Yeah, great question. So one of the sort of lessons from studying pretty much every taxa is generally big species are more flighty to humans than small species. And for years I said, oh, well, that means we have to be careful about big species, and big species then may not be found in urban areas. From an behavioral ecological perspective, that's a huge selection pressure on big species to become tolerant of humans. So when we did a large-scale study of tolerance, looking at the difference between the same species in a city and outside in a rural area, we found that the big species had strong selection for being tolerant. To some extent, that sort of refocuses the question on what allows species in general to coexist with humans. And we can have deer, living in cities, which isn't a great thing because they cause issues, or people perceive them as causing issues. They get hit by cars, and that's not good. And they can become quite tolerant, whereas maybe smaller species may not become as tolerant. But then they're not also going to be disturbed as much in the first place. So there's sort of an understanding and a potential for explaining patterns and potentially targeting particular tasks to think about, conservation on. However, for animals that nest, nesting is a very vulnerable time for many species, and disturbing animals from their nests isn't necessarily a good thing. So if we understand something about animals' fearfulness towards humans, we can then develop what are called buffer zones, setback zones. We can say, during the nesting season, you can't get this close to or this area, or we're going to close this area. I used to rock climb a lot. I went to school as an undergraduate in Boulder, Colorado. Some of the flat irons that are the rock roots outside Boulder were closed for several months during eagle nesting season because there were eagles nesting on some of the rocks. That's an example of having a management that's sensitive to animals being disturbed by humans. We can be a little more quantitative about that using things like flight initiation distance, and we can think about where trails might go with respect to colonial birds or whatever.
When it comes to some protected species that might be prey to particular predators, should we be careful when it comes to exposing them to their sort of common natural predators, in the sense that, specifically, is it possible that if they are not exposed to the natural predators, they might lose their evolved anti-predator responses?
Yeah, so I have a whole research program that looks at sort of ecological and evolutionary histories of exposure to predators. So if you're an island species, there's an island effect, where animals on islands are often mellower than animals on the mainland, and that could be driven in part because there's fewer predators on islands. And if you're on a predator-free island, there's no benefit from engaging in anti-predator behavior, and we expect anti-predator behavior to be lost or attenuated. In the extreme cases, this can lead to, island naivete, that you can sort of walk up to animals, they don't recognize predators. And that's a problem when they suddenly have predators, whether a predator comes to an island or animals are brought from islands and reintroduced to areas where there might be predators. Australia is a perfect example of this. I think we're up to 38 extinctions of mammals since European settlement. Australia has the worst record of recent mammalian extinctions. This is largely driven by the introduction of cats and foxes by Europeans, along with rabbits, which sustained high populations of these animals, and landscape changes. But predation is clearly a barrier also to reintroducing animals. You bring animals from one area, you put them in another area, these new predators eat them. And they might not even eat them, they might just surplus kill them. So, you dump a bunch of wallabies out, and 20 are killed the first night by a local fox or cat. So then the question is, well, is it ecological or evolutionary experience that has been lost? And there's ways of beginning to diagnose this, and we're trying to reverse the trend in various ways. Colleagues have designed ways to train predators, to train prey to recognize predators. So you pair just normal associative learning, you pair something that is initially benign with something that's scary, and then animals make that association. We've successfully trained Tamar wallabies to respond to the sight of foxes, even though they did not evolve with foxes. Importantly, Andrea Griffin's work showed that this is socially transmitted. So once you get this going, it can be transmitted in the groups because wallabies aggregate to forage, that animals seeing other animals being afraid of predators, they will then learn to be afraid of predators as well. So that's great. Social learning can be an accelerant for all sorts of things. In this case, that's a good thing. One of my colleagues, with several colleagues, Catherine Mosby and Mike Letnick, and a series of postdocs, and research assistants, and students, we've been trying something different. Catherine had the insight that, training prey to recognize predators is inefficient and doesn't always work. But what if you let them sort of grow up with predators? What if you throw predators into places where they're growing up and living? The survivors, if there are survivors, will may be selected or may have learned how to deal with them. So we argued about this for a long time, and then we are pretty much finishing up our third 3-year round of funding looking at this in burrowing bettongs and greater bilbies in a place called the Arid Recovery Reserve in South Australia, in the arid zone of South Australia. And what we have there is Catherine and her husband had created a 123 square kilometer fenced reserve where they were able to keep cats and foxes and dingoes out of the reserve. And they then took animals, for bettongs at least, from offshore predator-free islands. Burrowing bettongs are extinct on mainland Australia. They were driven extinct by cats and foxes. But they took them from predator-free offshore islands, put them in the reserve, and for a while there were thousands of them. The idea is that in the 123 square kilometers is divided into large paddocks. So we have like 25 square kilometer paddocks, 36 square kilometer paddocks. And we put animals in these paddocks, and then in one of the paddocks, we dumped some cats. And what we found was that they didn't drive them extinct. In fact, the population went up. And then we put more cats in, and they can live with a lot of cats. Once they get going, and they can coexist, and the population of wallabies increase, of bilbies and bettongs in this case, increase. We have controlled paddocks where the animals were not exposed to predators, and then we wanted to know whether you took these animals from the control area, no predators, the treatment area with predators, with cats, and we moved them to an area with cats, are there survival differences? And for the greater bilbies, we found that bilbies that had lived with cats for several years survived better than those bilbies that didn't. And for bettongs, we did this twice, we found no effect. And we're puzzled by that, but that shows that this pre-release predator conditioning seems to work for at least some species and not others. Now, what's interesting is we tracked the bettongs and the bilbies, and we found all sorts of really interesting changes in their anti-predator behavior over time as a function of living with predators or not. But it seemed to work for one species and not others. Two of our proposals have been aspiring to release them outside the fence to a reserve that a partner has where they've limited cat and fox populations. And we wanted to see if this actually can help create sustainable populations outside a fenced reserve. And our partners haven't been able to get the populations of cats and foxes down to a low enough level that we thought that we'd have any chance of having animals survive. We didn't think that was ethical, so we haven't done that, which is kind of frustrating, but that's the challenge. So in Australia and New Zealand, large fenced reserves are part of the solution these days to recovering prey that have been decimated or driven extinct by predators. But as soon as you put animals into these, they don't have predators, they get no experience, so it makes things worse. The populations go up, you have a whole suite of other problems, they overeat the vegetation. So ultimately, whether or not we can get these animals outside reserves and create sustainable populations, which I hope we can, or whether we're going to just have a bunch of big reserves, you can't have a big reserve with no predators. You got to put predators in to sort of manage a population as well. So even with endangered species. So this is where we are today. It's pretty exciting, and I think there's a lot of interesting insights from any predator behavior for conservation.
So earlier I've asked you about how we humans might have been shaping the anti-predator responses of other species when it comes to protection of particular species. Um, would you like to give us some other examples of how, by protecting other species, we might shape the evolution of animal phenotypes, like, for example, in terms of behavior and physiology, and I mean, the cases where that might have perhaps a bad impact?
I'm a little confused in the question, but I mean, I think that um, for prey that have evolved with predators, there are several ways that they can express their natural anti-predator behavior. And one is they don't require any experience to do it,
Mm.
and another is it gets turned on by exposure to predators, so and honed. And for species where experience is required for the proper presentation of anti-predator behavior, depriving them of that experience isn't a great thing. So, when particularly in conservation, when we reintroduce animals, um, predation is a large failure for reintroduction failures, or a large cause of reintroduction failures. The animals you take from captivity or translocate from another area, move to an area with predators, they get killed, and that's an ethical problem, and it's a wildlife management problem, and um, and we need to deal with that, and we may need to expose animals to predators or teach them about predators before they go out, or we may need to teach them about other things. Golden lion tamarins are an example in Brazil where animals were brought from captivity and put out, and for the first number of years they weren't doing well at all, and then a huge sort of pre-release training program giving them exposure to predators in safe situations, teaching them how to forage on native foods in safe situations, having soft release cages that were really big, allowing them to sort of experience things before the gates were open and they could walk outside, led to a lot of success. It's a real conservation success story. And there's other ones out there. But I think that thinking about the ontogeny, the development of anti-predator behavior is important, and understanding the degree to which animals may require experience should and does inform conservation, particularly translocation or reintroduction strategies, which are tools used to um, recover populations where they weren't.
So, one last question. What would you say are some of the most important aspects of the behavior of a particular species whose knowledge contributes to its conservation? I mean, what are the most important things to know about the behavior of a particular species for us to contribute to its conservation, basically?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm going to say potentially a lot, but I don't really care if it is or isn't. I'm one of the founders of a field called conservation behavior, where we try to sort of take ideas about, insights from behavior and think about whether or not they're useful in an applied context. And I'm agnostic about whether it works or doesn't. I think all conservation has to be evidence-based. I think you have to design studies and questions and management interventions so that you can learn from successes and learn from failures. And I think there are many, many insights from behavior that could be useful in terms of population persistence. So when I say conservation, what I mean is we perceive ourselves as having too few of something and we want more of them. Wildlife management, I like to sort of say, is we perceive we have too many of something and we want fewer of them. And both for conservation and management, behavior in many cases are levers, levers of change, mechanisms that if you can understand what attracts animals to a location or what repels them from locations, you can use that attraction and repulsion, for example, to manipulate where animals go. So, whether or not you're interested in keeping, animals away from trash cans or roads, or you want to attract animals to safe places that where predators might be controlled, or you want to attract them to wildlife crossings. We just broke ground on what's going to be the biggest wildlife crossing in the world in Los Angeles that has been, that's being created over a large freeway, the 101, to allow mostly mountain lions to cross the road without getting killed. Mountain lions get hit by cars. They live in a large patch of isolated habitat in Los Angeles. But having gene flow between patches is essential for long-term persistence. That's a behavioral problem. I mean, it's a movement ecology problem, but it really comes down to how animals perceive the world around them. And I think there's many questions that can be done to understand, how you attract and repel animals broadly. Mate choice. I mean, every animal. It's not easy. I talk to a lot of veterinarians, and I think I'm not big on zoos, but I'm really big on zoo vets because zoo veterinarians, are the intellectual capital that allow us to understand comparative medicine, really. And they recognize that even very closely related species do very different things, have different evolved physiologies, and that there's an incredible diversity of ways that animals do things, but physiologically, but also behaviorally. If you have a captive breeding program, you got to get animals to breed. How do they breed? What are they looking for? Females need choices. Do males need choices? Huge literature on mate choice in animals, insights potentially for solving applied problems. I look at the world through a fearful lens, and there's as we've talked about, there's a bunch of insights from anti-predator behavior. But I think there's a number of recognitions and insights that could be useful in any given for some problems. And the question is, are they useful? I don't care. Let's ask the questions. Let's figure out whether they are or not, and then let's even be more sophisticated. Let's do a better job than physicians of doing comparative effective evaluation. So when biomedical scientists, when they want to get a new therapy approved, they're comparing it to a control. They're comparing it to a placebo. Well, that's great. We have all these drugs that are better than nothing, but some are more expensive. Some might be better than nothing, but not much better than nothing, whereas others are much better than nothing. So the whole field of comparative effectiveness evaluation is something that the drug companies don't want us to be doing, but nonetheless is something that's really important from a public health perspective. Same thing for conservation. Some things, maybe no-brainers, they have a big effect. They don't cost much, or they cost a lot, but they have a big effect. Many things may have small effects. Many things may have an effect in a particular context. So it's really about, developing a scientific approach to management that allows us to understand how behavior can be useful or not.
Mm-hmm. So let's end on that note then, Dr. Blumstein. Just before we go, would you like to mention where people can find you and your work on the internet?
I have a website at UCLA. You can Google my name, Daniel Blumstein, UCLA. I run a long-term study of marmots in Colorado. You can Google the RMBL Marmot Project. There's a lot of stuff out there.
Okay, I will be leaving some links to your work in the description box of this interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Great questions, and thank you for having me. It's an honor. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila de Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sunny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luís Caetano, Tom Wagner, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.